Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for January 28th, 2015. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. We're joined today by Jim Clausing online. Welcome, Jim. And Matt Kaiser here in Bedminster.
How's it going?
Good, thanks. And Stan Nurilov. Stan, you haven't been with us for a little bit of while. Welcome back.
Yeah, thank you.
And so let's go, by the way, I'm Brian Rexroad, and let's go ahead and jump into things. There's a big spooky new vulnerability out there, right? Sorry, I couldn't help it.
Oh man. Okay, no. This one's called Ghost, and there's actually a good reason for it. Turns out that the vulnerable code here is actually the get host by name and get host by name 2 functions in Glibc. Glibc is a library that's used heavily in Linux. Pretty much every machine out there running Linux or some other Unix variants is going to be running Glibc. Now the problem with this function here is we've got a call, and it's got a little bit of a complicated name. I'm not going to read the underscores. NSS hostname digits dots function used by get host by name. And it turns out that you can actually do a buffer overflow against this function. And the Qualys, who reported the bug, is saying that this has the ability to perform code execution if you can properly overwrite this bit of code. You only get, depending on the platform, 4 or 8 bytes worth of space that you can write into, which is not a lot, but apparently they've got proof of concept code against the XM email server showing that this is actually possible.
Right.
Now, there's been a lot said about this bug in the last day or so, and as of taping, we're still trying to figure out exactly how critical this is. I recommend that everybody be patching this. It's going to be a little bit difficult because it's so widely used. Basically, you're going to have to patch and then restart every process that uses Glibc. And at that point, you may as well reboot your whole box to make sure you've covered everything, because it is, like I said, so heavily used. Qualys has actually put out a list of software that they've looked at to say that these are not vulnerable, which is probably going to be a good list to start working on it as well.
It's a big help. It was some of the very more popular things that you would.
Yeah, I think Nginx, Apache, OpenSSH are not vulnerable. The thing about this bug is that it's not something you can really externally scan for until you've identified how it's used in each piece of software and whether or not it's actually vulnerable. Now, once you've identified something like that XM email server, you can write a tool to scan the network for that. But it's going to be a long slog figuring out who's vulnerable, who's not.
Well, and the wide variety of cases that might exist, right? So this has a lot of similarities to the shell shock vulnerability in that, the vulnerability was kind of buried in bash. It was a little bit esoteric in how you could, get bash to exhibit that vulnerability. But then the question is, when does bash get used? Well, it gets used in all kinds of sort of scripting activities in the background. This isn't a case where it's scripting, but it certainly is a case like. Now, explain a little bit. We haven't talked about buffer vulnerabilities or buffer overflow vulnerabilities for a while. And that's a very, generic thing that's kind of buried in, oftentimes associated with C code. Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. So in most programming languages, I think pretty much in any situation where you've got a processor and memory that needs to be allocated, when you define a variable in code, it allocates a certain amount of space for it. So if I say that I want to have a string and I want to have 5 characters, it'll give me whatever the representation for 5 characters is going to be in memory. There are functions which will operate on that allocated space. Some of the older ones, like string copy, which is actually one of the functions that's being called in this case, do not check that the space you're writing to is the same as the length of what you're writing to it. And what will happen is, if I've got a space that's 4 bytes long and I'm trying to write something that's 6 bytes into it, it'll keep writing beyond the end of where I'm supposed to be writing. And that's called a buffer overflow. And what'll happen is whatever you write into may be some other important part of memory. Maybe it'll give you the ability to overwrite the stack pointer and control the flow of code, which is a common case when you have buffer overflows. So it's one of the classic vulnerability types. If anybody's really interested in it and wants to get a little bit down in the weeds, Smashing the Stack for Fun and Profit is an old write-up by Aleph 1 in FRAC. I don't remember what issue it is, but if you Google for it, you'll find it. And that was like my first introduction to those, and it was a pretty good one.
Mine too, actually.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, so this has been around for a very long time, and I think this kind of points out sort of that balance between code efficiency and code, I guess, resiliency. I'll use the term resiliency. And that, there was a programming language you may have heard of called ADA, that had strict typing associated with it. That is basically, it bound you to you had to declare the size and the type of every variable, and there was checking for each time a function was called associated with those variables to specifically avoid buffer overflows, whereas C doesn't have those controls. It depends on the programmer to put those checks into place and protect against those. And so I think, I'm actually a little bit surprised that buffer overflow vulnerabilities, on one hand, still exist, or that we've had such a long, what I feel to be somewhat of a hiatus, that we haven't seen that many of them recently, or at least not buried in the C libraries. But this is a case where obviously they're coming to the surface again. And I think it's yet another example where we're going to see more and more of these vulnerabilities that are widespread across many different operating systems, applications, and things like that are dependent on similar code.
Yeah, and this is one of those cases like we talked about with the bash, that it kind of got, the vulnerability was introduced in there, and it sat there for a long time. The vulnerability actually has been there since November of 2000 and was fixed in May of 2013. But at the time, they didn't realize that it was potentially remotely exploitable, so they didn't make a big deal out of backpatching all of the versions of Linux that are on long-term support. So there are, some of the newer versions are not vulnerable to this because they're running the newer patched version, and it's now that all of the Linux distributions are backporting this patch and releasing patches for some of their older versions that are still under support. So it's one of those that slipped by for quite a while.
Yeah. That's a good point. It's another example like that. Now, it is encouraging. I wasn't aware of this before, that the newer versions are not susceptible. But
well, there's something I do want to say about that, is that sometimes you'll have code that there's a difference between dynamic compilation and static compilation. Now, if you've got code that's using glibc dynamically, it means it's going to reach out and grab whatever version's available on the system, and that means if you replace it on the system, you've fixed it across all the code that loads it dynamically. If you've got it statically compiled into the code you're using, you're going to have to recompile the whole thing to replace the bad code.
Right.
And identifying that's going to be a little bit of a trick. And I did want to say, Jim reminded me, you started talking about it being remotely exploitable. It is locally exploitable. That is, they do have proof of concept code that shows that you can overwrite this in the function locally. So if there's a way you can use it to, exploit something locally, if you're on the machine and you're able to feed a domain name that fits the characteristics to a local machine, a local application, you might be able to gain control of it and operate at its
You could use it
as its process.
privilege escalation attack.
Thank you, yeah. I was trying to say that, but it's a very roundabout way of doing it. Yeah.
all right, well, good. Well, thank you for bringing that. And so, Jim, I guess we've seen some zero-day activity on a flash vulnerability. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, I was actually, before yesterday, figured this was going to be the biggest story of the week, because last week it was getting a lot of press. Now all of a sudden this glibc thing's been getting a lot of press in the last 24 hours. Last week there were a couple of blog posts and a couple of security advisors out of Adobe about some 0 days, 2 different 0 days in Adobe Flash Player. And this resulted in Adobe actually releasing out-of-cycle patches over the weekend. So if you're running your Adobe to auto-update, you should have gotten prompted that your Flash player was out of date and needed updated, and should have been prompted to update that, or hopefully enterprises will be pushing out the new version of a Flash player this week. The big thing is that it was known to be used by the Angler exploit kit, was exploiting this in the wild last week. So if they could, if a bad guy could lure you to a site that gave you a crafted Flash video, Flash movie, they were able to exploit IE, Chrome, Firefox to get malware onto systems. So it was a big deal last week. As I said, fortunately, Adobe released out-of-cycle patches over the weekend. The currently available Flash player is patched for the known vulnerabilities that were being exploited as of last week.
Now, I've noticed that at least in some applications, Adobe's being a little more aggressive about patch management. That is, I think they used to give you the option of getting a notification. Now they have the option of automatically applying patches or getting a notification of patches, or you have the option of ignoring that. I think they obviously would discourage that. But do you know if that's true with Flash as well?
I believe so, but I don't remember. I know that that some of the browsers, if they're running an old version, can disable that, and I know Firefox was doing that prior to the updated version. So you may see instances of that in your browser where it says you've got an old version of Flash and you need to update it.
I think it's an option. I seem to recall seeing it this weekend.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's an encouraging move. I think the notion of updating software automatically is becoming a much more important aspect of because even mature software can have vulnerabilities in it. Okay, so Jim, maybe you can give us a little bit of an update on. Last week we talked a little bit about bad passwords, and we had talked about taking a look at getting an update on what's on the Honeypot. So tell us, what did you find?
Yeah, well, I was sorry I couldn't join you last week, but I was deathly ill actually at that point. So, but I did watch the show and was interested to see the report. And Matt actually since then had pointed out another blog post that was in Ars Technica about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is the most common password, but here's why that's misleading. And they actually make a couple of really good points in there that although 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is the most popular password, it's actually a much smaller percentage of all the passwords than was the case a couple of years ago. When I've done these in the past, after some of the password breaches, when I've done some of the analysis, you'll have password or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 being 5 or 10% of the passwords in use. And this Ars Technica article points out that in this latest data set, it's less than half of 1%. So that's actually a good sign. But since you guys talked about it last week, I decided it was time to go back and take a look at the Honeypot, since it's been quite a while since I've done one of these analyses. And this time I did not go back and analyze all of the passwords that we've ever captured since we started running this Honeypot. The Honeypot's been out there, kepo's been installed since July of 2011, and we've actually been getting Pop3 passwords on this Honeypot since 2009. But in this case, I just went back to about the 1st of September. It did actually, I think, probably went back to about the 30th of August. But I ran about 5 months worth of data through. And one of the first things I noticed was the quantity of the password guessing that we're getting against our kepo Honeypot has increased dramatically. Just in 5 months, we got 1.2 million password guesses, password attempts, versus in our first 2 years that we were running the Honeypot, we only had about 300,000. So that was the first big thing that I noticed. And again, I did most of this analysis using People, which is a software package by Robin Wood. But I also this time added some graphs that I got from Kepo Graph. So the first of those is this one here, which shows the top 20 days in the last 5 months where we got most of the probes. We had days where we had 50,000 guesses here, December 5th and December 21st. Even though this is a honeypot that doesn't really, isn't really advertised any place, it still gets an awful lot of attention. Now this one, just to give you a little sense of how things are going here, you can see from this graph the number of probes per day. Right around Thanksgiving, we saw the number of probes increasing quite a bit. We've been seeing where we had been seeing 3, 4, 5,000 probes a day. Now we're seeing these peaks upwards of 50,000, and the baseline up in the 20, 25, 30,000 probe per day range. That was one of the big things that came from this analysis. Again, the top 10 passwords that were attempted, nothing particularly new here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, admin, password. As that Ars Technica article suggested, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which is the default Kepo password. If you type that in, you will get in and you can get on the honeypot and try to play around. It's the most popular password, but it was less than 0.5% of all the attempts in the last 5 months.
So Jim, can you, I guess one of the things I'm kind of wondering here, are there particular ports and protocols that Kepo is kind of watching for, or is it willing to accept on any port?
Kepo itself is an SSH honeypot, so it's, that's one of our top 10 most probed ports every week, doing password guessing, and that's what Kepo is there to catch, is SSH password attempts.
So it's not looking at Telnet, and you'd mentioned Pop3 earlier. That's a separate activity?
Right. This particular honeypot, we've been capturing Pop3, and we don't actually capture Telnet passwords real well at the moment. We see the Telnet attempts, but we've been capturing the Pop3 passwords and the SSH password guessing for several years now. And so most of the, actually all of the password guesses that I'm going over in this particular analysis were SSH password attempts.
Okay.
And since it's SSH, it's not real surprise that root is the username that is attempted most often. The one that kind of surprised me was this PLCM SPLP. I have no idea what that user is, but it made the top 10, but it was only 174 attempts, again, out of 1.2 million. This one was kind of interesting to me. I was kind of expecting most of the password guessing attempts to be one of these libraries, and it turns out that it's actually PuTTY that is, at least, is identified as the client that is being used in the vast majority of the attempts. Yeah, there are several versions of PuTTY, as you can see in here. Release 0.63, and this one that looks like a custom version there that's May 14th, 2009. But yeah, so most of the password guessing attempts seem to actually be using PuTTY. It doesn't seem to be as automated as I thought it was going to be.
Curious. Yeah.
So to interject briefly, I did take a look at PLCM SPLP here, and turns out that's related to Polycom SIP phones, and that's a default password and username for
Oh,
that
no
case.
kidding.
So apparently somebody else knows that.
Apparently.
Now, one of the things that kepo as a honeypot does is if you log in, if you guess the right password, which by default is 1234556, you can add other passwords that'll let the user in. Then the bad guy they're presented with a Debian-ish looking Unix that they can, or Linux that they can then get in and play with. And so one of the things that kepo can keep track of is, what are they trying to do? And so this shows a graph of the number of times that it appears that a human is doing something, whether they're trying to download another tool. One of the first things they usually do is try to shut off IP tables. So I thought this was interesting, even though we've seen this huge increase in the number of guessing attempts since about the end of November. Once they're in, the actual volume of things that they do it has spiked a couple of times, but we haven't seen the volume increase in the human activity that we've seen in the password guessing itself.
Well, and this kepo is a kind of a well-known tool. So if you are actually capturing somebody in here, it's likely it's not a particularly sophisticated attacker. Is that a correct?
Yeah, that's probably true. I've done a couple of things to try to hide the fact that it's kepo here, and there is actually another version that I was thinking of updating to sometime in the near future that tries harder to hide the fact that it's kepo to try to catch more folks who, once they log in, if they see that it's kepo, they immediately log back out. Yeah, I thought it was interesting that the IPs that did most of the probing were all from a subnet in Hong Kong. That I suspect that a lot of those machines are compromised machines. I don't expect that those were actually where the bad guys were located.
Right.
But I thought it interesting that 9 of the top 10 were all in the same subnet in Hong Kong.
Wow. Yeah, that is a little bit, I guess, unexpected from my point of view anyway.
Yeah. And then one of the other things that I've looked at in the past was the length of the passwords that they were guessing. And again, these lengths and the order here is virtually unchanged from the last 4 times I did this analysis. The most common length of password guessed was 8, and that was 20.5% of the passwords guessed were 8 characters in length. 18% of them were 6 characters in length. Dropped off pretty quick after the top 4 there, down to where passwords of length 13, which is the 10th most common length of a password, were just 1.5% of those guessed. And those over 55 characters in length were 0.004%. The longest passwords guessed in the last 5 months, this says 100. That's actually probably an artifact of that's the limit of the size of the password field in the database where I store all of this. So they're actually probably run a little longer than that. But the 100-character ones, they looked like they were just passing the Linux hashes as the password itself. So the newer password hashes in Linux, if you look at Etsy Shadow, they're $6 and then some sort of a SHA-1 or SHA-2 or something. And then some additional stuff at the end. And it looks like these long passwords they just took the contents of this Etsy shadow and shoved the hash in there as if it were the password. So that's not going to work most of the time. The longest real password guess that I saw was probably about 80 characters. I didn't actually count that up, but
yeah, tossing those hashes at it, that to me, that's kind of a head scratcher. You can kind of wonder if it's deliberate and they know some sort of a programming bug where something accepts that, or if it's a case where they were had a programming bug.
That's what it looks like to me. Is unless they've found some version of Linux where you can do some sort of a pass the hash kind of a thing, like you can do, with Windows in certain circumstances. I really don't understand what those hashes were doing in there, but I don't know. But we've actually seen those for some time in the data. So somebody's been using that as their attempt to guess for some time. I don't know what exactly they were hoping to accomplish. But.
All right. Well, great. Thank you, Jim. It's always an entertaining, perspective to see the types of passwords that are being guessed and the activities taking place there. So let's shift gears a little bit here. A lot of people think of NSA as an intelligence agency. They have an information assurance directorate that is basically their focus is to develop capabilities to protect information, and occasionally they put out some guidance. And Stan, you took a little bit of a look at this, and they were providing some specific guidance around mass destructive malware.
Right. Well, there's been a lot of cases in the media, right, that talk about destructive malware taking down corporations, and NSA, I guess, they always release guidance, but here was focused on what to do with destructive type threats. And I think if you look at the guidance they have, and it's very good, I encourage everyone to do it who is in charge of protecting the enterprise, it's mostly standard things that we're kind of used to. They're centered around preventing, detecting, and containing the threat. Make sure that you employ some sort of protection on your perimeter, something on the inside, monitor all the logging that you can. These are all complex ideas, but one thing that most major enterprises are aware of, but maybe some medium-sized ones or smaller ones kind of tend to forget, is this recovery. Be ready to respond to an incident. If a destructive malware type of incident occurs in your enterprise, what are you going to do to respond to it? So it's something important to consider, and the paper covers that and some of the aspects, of the traditional, kind of protecting yourself, monitoring it, but also don't forget about having a good plan for doing incident response and recovery.
Right. So, I guess some of the things that kind of stuck out when I was taking a look at this is, first of all, this notion of prevention. Obviously, you want to try to prevent the event from occurring in the first place. But part of what they talked about, I think is generally good practice in any case, is the idea of segmenting networks off. That is, don't let them into the entire enterprise. If you have a large enterprise, you want to try to get it into smaller segments so that even if they did get into a portion of it, it makes it more difficult to get into other portions of the enterprise. And so, some corporations are kind of structured that way inherently. Some others might have to do something deliberate in order to create.
And some
those
of the bigger
partitions.
companies, right? They have the hierarchy. HR is a separate branch, and some other, IT is something separate, and they might have their own systems. But at the same way, we've also seen people converging. Putting everything in one spot. It depends on each enterprise. That's why everybody kind of has to look at what they're doing, what is their business, and decide how to protect it the best way with what they've got. And the thing about putting things into separate enclaves, that's a very good principle of information assurance, right? Separation of privileges kind of speaks to that as well. And another thing that was interesting they pointed out is you make sure that your admin credentials are very well protected and are not reused everywhere. again, these are all standard kinds of preventative measures that we've kind of always described on the show and read about. It's something important to know.
And I guess an observation of mine, for the few mass destructive malware the events that have occurred so far, I think in each one of those cases we can at least have some pretty good, reasonable expectation. The evidence points to, I should say, that the attackers had a reasonable amount of time within that enterprise gone undetected before the actual mass destructive malware event had occurred. In fact, if you think about the things that would need to take place in order to conduct an event like that, they not only have to get into the enterprise, but they have to advance their credentials to the point where they'd have some means to distribute the malware widely across the network, and they'd have to have some idea of how to conduct that and actually get it in there. And so I think an important aspect of this, I think that in some of the recommendations they pointed out got into some more specific areas, that is having a good analytical capability in place to identify, it's likely they're people, they're trying to map the network, they're trying to do things to support this activity that's going to potentially take place. And so you want to try to pick up any little mistakes that they make along the way that might reveal their presence and give you an opportunity to eradicate that before there's even an opportunity to do a mass destructive malware event. So, kind of supporting that detection thing. I think it's a little more than detection. I think it's just having a good cognizance of what's going on and right. Picking up on the subtleties that might occur that are in advance of an attack like that. And then last, you'd mentioned the containing thing. I think we all do things, maybe not everybody, but we all try to do things to back up our systems, back up the data, be prepared for a failure of a system. But I don't think too many are thinking in terms of thousands of systems being wiped out.
Right.
And so you need to put a little thought into that. That is, you're not going to have necessarily resources to be able to restore all the systems at the same time. Just the virtue of having to, download the data if it's on a network-based storage system, the challenges will be perhaps bandwidth. So I think it's going to be important to lay out your priorities. Who really needs to get back into service first? Is it the officers of the company or is it the finance organization? Is it HR to make sure that the paychecks get, so there are thoughts that need to be put into that in terms of what things can be put on the back burner for a little bit and what things really need to get done quickly to restore the capability. Maybe it's the folks that are actually doing the restorals you need to.
I think they need to have their own backups and maybe at least one or two machines that they can, a number of machines that they can immediately start launching a recovery effort from that were maybe cold spares sitting on the side, not on the network, not powered on, that can just be brought in for this purpose. And also, I think you're right that the prioritization of who needs to get back online first has to go with the business needs. If everybody goes down, do you need to bring up, is there a PR wing that has to be immediately responding to customers to say, we know what this is, we'd like to tell you as much as we can, what are the critical business functions, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we still have, from what I can tell, Sony is still reporting that some of their functions are not back up to speed because they're still reeling from the attacks back in December. So I think this is an exercise that I'd like to see more companies go through. I know it'd be a painful one for the first time out to say we are probably not prepared for many companies. But I do think it's going to be more and more important as this is becoming a more prevalent tactic.
And I'm glad you used the term exercise because I think practice ultimately is what makes perfect. Even practicing on small scale. Think about a group, imagine a scenario or actually, simulate a scenario where 20 people have their machines lost or, some servers lost or a handful of servers are lost and actually go through the exercise of restoring those, perhaps on separate resources so they're, it's just a whole dummy exercise. But that practice will be a good education in the kinds of things that, I hadn't thought about that. Doing is really the best learning tool.
Right, and even discussing the priority of who you're gonna bring up first is important, because if the event happens and you haven't done that, I'm sure that each enclave of the business is going to try to say, no, I'm the most important, bring me up first, and there's just going to be a lot of confusion and chaos, and you don't want that in your incident response.
So perhaps a publicized prioritization plan so that people know what to expect. Absolutely. And many organizations, they have a business continuity plan in place. And so to have a business continuity plan that deliberately considers the notion of mass destructive malware, I think is going to be a value aspect. To be able to tie those together, not necessarily treat it as a separate type of activity.
When you call it mass destructive malware, though, I think you also have to consider the less scary name of ransomware, where you've got something like CryptoLocker or CTB Locker, where it has the same effect. All the important business-related files are going to be gone, and you better have a backup. So for people who are thinking, I'm not a nation-state target, I'm a small business, wait and see what happens when your main file server gets completely encrypted and you have no backup. I think it's the same effect. Actually, I shouldn't have said wait and see what happens. What I should have said is you get your stuff together right now and start thinking about it.
Well, actually, you make a good point. I think we've pointed out a number of times before that CryptoLocker is one that has the capability to go out and look for network attached storage. We have to keep in mind, if you have online backup systems, the online backup systems could potentially be subjected to a mass destructive malware event. So there need to be deliberate activities to isolate those so that they wouldn't necessarily be victimized in the same way.
If you can synchronize an offline backup system with the same files and have it ready for this case, I think this is an idea that's hit its prime already. Now that we've got this, I've seen CryptoLocker do it to network drives, and it is not pretty.
Yeah. So, on the note of not pretty, well, it's actually not so bad. Let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here. And not a whole lot of new things here, just basically a progression of some of the previous reports that we had. First is scan sources and probes on port 32764 TCP. And this, again, as we've mentioned before, we're actually looking at the number of sources that are doing the probing. It's not increasing significantly. We certainly do have that activity taking place. And if you recall, this particular port is identified as a backdoor port that was identified in a variety of home router devices. This is, in fact, I think if I understand correctly, the patches are available. Most systems probably, or devices probably have not been patched, but even with the patch, apparently the backdoor sort of still exists, but it's a little more hidden. So this is just yet another example of the Internet of Things that are not well devised to be connected to the internet and need to have better security controls around them. Next item here is scan and probes on port 7001 TCP. This is associated with Oracle Web Logic. And, but in any case, it's a specific source that's been probing on this port. We've been reporting on this for weeks. You can see sort of the regular cycle of probing activity. And, occasionally there's some other activity that's taking place here, but fundamentally, this particular source is, basically the originator of most of the activity. And it's also probing on a number of other ports that we've identified before. It's port 110, that's Pop3, 1433, that's Microsoft SQL database, 1521, that's Oracle database, 1723, which is a point-to-point protocol, tunneling protocol, that is, 3128, which is Squid proxy, 3306, which is MySQL database, so they like to go after databases here, and then 8081, that's HTTP proxy. So a number of ports that are being probed by this same source address on a variety of, perhaps looking for a variety of capabilities there.
It's interesting you point out there that there's another follow-up address that does the...
There is another address. It doesn't look directly associated. It may be associated. It's not in the same address block or anything like that, but it is also in China, and you're right. It is making connection attempts, and too many of them are successful to be by chance. And so it's got some basis of information that it's using to go, so it could be a follow-up connection activity that is taking place associated with that.
That actually reminds me of a well-known university here that does something similar. There's one IP address that scans for whatever it is they're looking for, and then they have a follow-on IP address that does the connection and additional probing.
Right. And generally, from the attacker's point of view, that's a more efficient way to do it. It also may provide a little bit more anonymity in the process. But all right, next item here is scan probes on port 7547 TCP. I think we've talked about this one before. It's associated with a protocol that's called CPE, that is Customer Premise Equipment WAN Management Protocol, WAN being Wide Area Network. It's actually documented in a document from the DSL form. I think it's Technical Report 69 or TR 69. In any case, this is intended to be a protocol used for managing DSL modems effectively. There's actually an article about this that indicates that there are a number of vulnerabilities in some of the implementations that are potentially exploitable. Now, this particular scanning activity here actually is attributable to a particular United States university that apparently is, I'm going to say this is innocuous activity that we're detecting here. They're scanning around, identifying vulnerable devices, but I don't think it's for the purpose of exploit. I think it's for the purpose of conducting some research or studies around this. But that doesn't mean that others couldn't be doing that similar activity and potentially exploiting this. In any case, perhaps we'll get some more information about this as time goes on, hopefully reported in a responsible manner. Next item is of a similar ilk, different port, different activity clearly, but it's scan probes on port 502 TCP. This one happens to be associated with Modbus over TCP IP, Modbus being basically a function for industrial control systems. So we've heard a lot in the press about the potential of industrial control systems or control systems being exploitable, inclusive of manufacturing systems, water control or water filtration systems, those sorts of things. Again, this activity, and you can see that the similarity in the pattern from the previous one, activity from a U.S. university. I'm going to declare that as innocuous as a part of their research activities. That is, when I say innocuous, it does not appear to have malicious intent associated with it.
I just keep thinking, if you're going to hook up an industrial control system to the internet, don't.
Yeah.
Don't.
Yeah. I mean, clearly there should be protective controls around that. It should not be something that could be directly addressable from the internet. There should be firewalls around that, or at least, locally, at the very least, an IP change thing. So I'm only accepting from the addresses I expect to expect connections from, as opposed to allowing it to be accessible from the internet.
Or don't even make it apparent that this is an IP address that's even related to something like that. Require users to VPN or hop through several other systems to get to it. It's still internet facing to a degree, but it makes it much harder for a critical system to be exposed like this.
Absolutely. Very good point. Next item here is top 10 most probed ports, and we've been seeing this activity fairly consistently for the last several weeks here. Top one on the list, port 135 TCP. This is associated with some really kind of strange activity we've seen. Next item is 9064 TCP, which is a proxy port, and then followed by port 23 TCP and port 22 TCP. We talked about that password guessing activity, and it's certainly likely related to that. Followed by port 53 UDP. This can be either scanning for DNS servers, open DNS resolvers, or occasionally what can happen is it can look like reconnaissance activity if those DNS servers are being used in reflective denial of service attacks. Next one followed by 1900 UDP. Same explanation as port 53 UDP, looking for SSDP or Simple Service Discovery Protocol servers that can be used in those attacks. And next one, similar, port 123 UDP. That's Network Time Protocol, which is also used in the reflection attacks. So all of those are sort of grouped together here. And then that's followed by port 110 TCP, that's POP3, as we talked about earlier about a particular address as it was scanning on that particular port. There's other activity as well. And then followed by port 445 TCP, that's Configure, and then 8080 TCP, often used for proxies. And so the search for anonymizing proxies goes on. Taking a little bit of a closer look at the Pop3 activity, that's port 110 TCP. Most scans, again, in this case, were from a U.S. university, and there are others contributing to this that are likely more nefarious in terms of their intent. You can see sort of the regular scanning activity, but as you can also see that recently in the last, we're looking at 90 days of activity, but in the last couple of weeks here, the density of that activity has increased significantly, hence the reason it showed up on our top 10 report. Next item here is the most sources doing that probing, and far and above the others is port 23 TCP, but the relative proportion of port 23 has gone down a little bit since our last recent reports. So we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at that to see what's going on with it. And some of the other ports here, we've mostly talked about those. We see BitTorrent showing up on here, a 1900 UDP, and there's clearly some ICMP activity showing up on here. But taking a little closer look at the port 23, and we're looking at the last 180 days. You know, when I saw the proportion of activity going down a little bit, I thought, well, maybe this is, you know, that port 23 probing activity is going down a little bit as well, but it's not exactly the case. It looks like we're just sort of in a lull of activity here. What you can see is over the last, few weeks, there, it looks like maybe a downward trend, but I wouldn't treat that as a downward trend per se. We're still seeing spikes, that is, increases in the number of sources that are doing the probing, which indicates that there's somebody with a botnet that's commanding those devices to do it. And I suspect that basically what they've done is gone into sort of a maintenance mode where they have some proportion of the exploited devices doing scanning activity and another proportion of those that are probably being used for other activities. And I would suspect that most of that is denial of service attack activity. So there's been a lot of discussion in the media about Lizard Squad stressors. There are a number of others that are out there, unfortunately, and as a consequence, they're going out and searching for devices to include as a part of their botnets. And last but not least here, I wanted to share with you the daily reconnaissance index. We haven't looked at this in several weeks, so we're looking at the last 400 days of activity, and basically there are two normalized contributions in this index. There's the number of probes that we see and the number of sources that we see doing the probing activity. And as you can see here, the activity's been sort of trending up over the last few months, and consistent with a lot of the reports that we've been bringing to you here. Part of it due to the Internet of Things, more probing activity associated with that, and the reflective denial of service attack activity can also contribute to this as well. And so that's a little bit of a disturbing trend. We like to see this in the stock market. We don't like to see it in the reconnaissance index. That's our show for today. We'd like to thank you for joining us, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at threattrack@list.att.com. You can find ThreatTraq on the AT&T Tech channel. It's att.com/ThreatTraq, and it's also available on YouTube as well as on iTunes. And you can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATT Security. So I'd like to thank you, Stan. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Jim, online. I'm Brian Rexroad, and we'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, keep your network safe.